episode 79 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian, just having finished my 13th year, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, by my interview guests, and by the listeners who contact the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast is something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Beth in Illinois, Katrina in Idaho, and Stephanie in North Dakota. Anna in New Jersey wrote, I love your podcast. I wish I had discovered it sooner because as a library assistant, sometimes without a district librarian, I have had to face a lot of issues you talk about. I love the episode in which you said people ask if librarians have to go to school to scan books. Laugh out loud. I might have been one of those people until I started to work in a school library, and that inspired me to go for my MLIS and become a librarian so I can make libraries fabulous for our students. Thank you so much for giving us a voice and creating a community around your podcast. And thank you so much for reaching out. I love hearing from listeners because I got to tell you, sitting by myself recording these episodes and even when I'm doing my interviews, it helps me to hear who's listening. And the more I learn about the listeners, it gives me a better idea of the direction this podcast should take, especially looking forward to season 3. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback, questions, and episode suggestions, either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. I wanted to give a great big thank you to everyone who put together Connecticut's virtual nerd camp this past weekend. It was incredibly well organized and accessible to anyone who wished to attend. There was an impressive lineup of authors and offerings for educators and librarians of all grade levels. There were 2 morning and 2 afternoon sessions with 10 different rooms to choose from, in addition to an opening and a closing remarks. Having attended Nerd Camp in Michigan last summer, I appreciate an undertaking like this must be daunting. And under the given circumstances, I'm sure the question of even still hosting a Nerd Camp would have seemed an obvious question. But it was clear that in every session I attended that all the attendees were having a terrific time coming together, and albeit a virtual but a wonderful experience was had by all. Another thank you this week goes to my husband and my sons. After recording virtual job interviews with Courtney Pentland last week, it got me thinking, even if you aren't interviewing this summer, the suggestion of optimizing where you conduct your meets or your Zooms for work is a really good idea. Given the likely possibility we will all return in the fall with some aspect of virtual programming in place, I wanted to see if I could improve the space I use. And we struggle with backlighting in the rooms that we have with good Wi-Fi and adequate outlets to keep our devices charged. So I wasn't interested in purchasing room darkening shades or drapes. And the men in my family devised a really inexpensive and a really effective solution, which I thought I would share with all of you. First of all, they measured the inside of the window, meaning the glass portion minus the frame. And then my sons went to the hardware store and they purchased a bunch of yardsticks. And if you know anything about yardsticks, they're super cheap. They're like $1 a piece. And then they asked the salesperson if they had any like oversized broken down cardboard boxes that they could take. And of course, they were directed to a bin of broken down boxes and they could take whatever they wanted. We already own a staple gun. So they stapled the yardsticks so that the yardsticks would support the cardboard as it stood upright in the frame of the window and it wouldn't like topple over. And they could just use the staple gun to do that. And then they sprayed each board with like, we had leftover primer or white paint that would work, and then just allowed that to dry. And now when I have my meets for work or I do a Zoom, I can rest the cardboard inserts inside each of the windows, and it eliminates all this glare that we get during during daytime, whenever I'm doing interviews or recordings and such. Side note, I did hear that the next batch of Google Meet updates will include the ability to change the backgrounds, just like you can currently in Zoom. But I agree with Courtney that not only are the simulated backgrounds sort of imprecise, I can imagine it might be unnecessarily distracting to anybody who is in your meeting. And now for today's episode, Collection Development, and my interview with Carrie Betts. I'm so excited today to be sharing with you a conversation I am finally having with Carrie Betts. I met up with Carrie Betts, and I always do at our state conference, but last October, Carrie and I were presenting at competing time slots, and I couldn't attend her session, obviously. And so, Carrie, asking you to be on the podcast today is really just a selfish way for me to solve the problem of having missed your session on collection development. So thank you for being here today.
I'm happy to be here, and I don't find that selfish at all.
Well, I'll tell you what, I know how many people fit in those rooms, and I'm going to guarantee you that the number of listeners who would like to hear your sage advice on collection development is going to be very much appreciated, because I've been to your library. I've visited it myself, I think 2 years ago. My district encourages teachers of all walks to shadow one another each year. And I spent an entire day in your library. I looked like a tourist. I was taking pictures. I was being nosy. Would you, for listeners who have not had the pleasure of walking through your space, would you tell us a little bit about your school and your library and how your teaching responsibilities work into the rest of your library program?
Absolutely. So I work in a K-5 elementary school building, and I get to see kindergarten, first grade, and second grade weekly for 45 minutes. So I see each of those classes on a schedule. And then for grades 3, 4, and 5, I push into those classes. So I have built in, I work for a great district who has really worked with librarians. And so they build in time for things like collection development, build in time for going into classes and allowing for students to come in at need when they need to work on a computer, or when they need to get a book because they finished their book, and that sort of thing. So I have like a part fixed, part flex schedule. That's not true for the whole district, so it does vary from building to building. I know some teachers who still have regularly scheduled grades 3 through 5 classes, but those are in smaller buildings. My building has approximately 550 plus kids. And I also work with a preschool. We usually work out a time to bring those preschoolers that are in the building in to do at least a story time with them.
I'm very lucky. I do have a fixed schedule, but I have a few opportunities during my year. I'm not going to say during my day, but across the year specifically for collection development. And it occurred to me, I've shown my schedule to somebody who's not a librarian, and they look at that open space, and I get two responses. I get, "Oh, is that your prep?" Or I say, "Oh no, that's my collection development." And they look at me and say, "Oh, so when you buy the books?" And I'm like, well, because that's a difference. When you say I'm doing collection development to a librarian, well, that makes complete sense, because I could do that for hours and hours and hours and still not be done. But when you say to a teacher, "No, that's my collection development time," a lot of teachers look at you sort of like, "Wow, I wish I had an hour where I didn't have to do anything." And I'm like, oh, but it's not.
Yeah.
Collection development. And honestly, it was one of my favorite classes. It's foundational. Doesn't matter what kind of library field you're going into. Can you tell me what motivated you specifically to pick collection development as your presentation topic at our state conference?
Absolutely. So I had been attending state conferences, and I attend the ASL National Conference every other year when I can. And what I was noticing within my small group of librarian friends and within even at those conferences, is that we often invite speakers who do a lot of reading. And this is not to negate their awesome insight into books. But when we have an expert come in and say, these are the great books for the year, what I was noticing is that then librarians often are like, oh, okay, I'll just order all of those books. Or like really honing in on, did you see this person's list? This is a great list. And so we become following these celebrity readers to a certain extent, which is fine if we're using that the right way. If we have the right mindset going in. And I really wanted to, I was motivated to do a session on collection development to kind of help people understand that it's more than just getting that great book list and trying to figure out how to pay for it.
Right. No, and I think you're right, because we want to reassure ourselves that we're doing the best thing for our program by simply buying highly recommended books. But it fails to recognize the importance of how that works within the current collection we occupy, and more importantly, the who we're serving, our school community that we're serving, and the priorities of the teachers. And we'll get into that some more. But I agree, throwing money at a list doesn't look at the bigger implications of how this works with the larger collection. I will be the first to admit, I was not in a library when I got my master's degree in library science. I was a stay-at-home mom, drowning in diapers and small children. And so
I know that.
Yes.
Same for me.
And to be quite honest, it was a very theoretical conversation, because I had to, I was told to imagine what it would be like to be in my first library, or I was told, go to your public library, and waltz through and see, and if you can apply some of these concepts. And so I know I would have benefited more if I had an actual library to work with while I was in collection development. So I'm absolutely fascinated at this topic. So, we are in the middle of interview season, and there is always a question in there about our collection development. It's sometimes phrased like, how do you prioritize what you purchase each year? And that is something similar like that. Is when we are asked, how do we prioritize what we buy each year? That really speaks to the larger topic of collection development, doesn't it?
Yes. And so, the interesting thing about that question is it can change every year if you're doing, if you're really into your community and understanding your community needs, right? So if my community, for example, even right now, as we think in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, where we're all switching to this online learning format and trying to figure out, what are the best needs for my community right now? And do I need to be purchasing more ebooks is hot topic. Of course, we need to purchase more ebooks and that kind of thing. Even though if you listen to the kids' feedback, though, they're saying, oh my gosh, I don't want to read on my computer right now. So that's an interesting subject altogether. But as things change, we have to adapt for that. One example, 1 year I'm looking at, right when I first got in there, and I'm realizing that all these teachers, maybe run into this, want the same book in their classroom to, teach a concept, right? They're all covering the life cycle of a frog. And so instead of housing 4 hard copy books of the life cycle of a frog. It's better for my investment if I purchase an ebook that is a multi-user ebook that is at the level of the teacher that's requiring it. I don't want the life cycle of a frog at a 5th grade level for a 2nd grade classroom. And I want all the teachers to be able to use it and access it. So it's really analyzing those small things. So when we say prioritize for a year, I might not fall into the norm in there because I think it does change for every year. I think that a lot goes into, looking at that. And so, yeah, you come up with priorities at the beginning of the year of what's most needed.
Well, and I think it's also fair to say that where you are in your relationship to your collection, because you build a relationship with a collection. And I have had an opportunity to walk into a library, and now this is my library, and you can see that collection development varies wildly from librarian to librarian, that our purchasing preferences
Yes.
and our purchasing biases are very obvious when you walk into a library for the first time, and we inherit the last person's purchasing priorities. And can I ask you, how many years have you been invested in your current library?
In my current library, it has been, I believe I just finished my 4th year in my current library.
Okay, which means that you have had 4 years to make your mark and to either undo what the previous person left behind. I use the word inherit, but what we inherit. We are either undoing or we are forging new paths, depending on what kind of person ran the program before you did.
It's really interesting that you bring that up because this is my 2nd time inheriting a library. And so going through that process of getting to know the connection and then starting to ask questions about that collection and trying to, you can get lost in trying to decipher what the thought process was behind the previous collection. So if you're better than me and able to avoid that, that's a good thing. But I'm always asking questions about, well, why is this here?
Yeah, it's our libraries are time capsules. And I talked about this a little bit in an earlier episode, but the idea when we move into a library, we are not walking into an empty room. We don't, the person who left the collection. The person who left the supplies, left the borders that go around your showcases, or they left the, whatever displays they might have had or props they used or holiday decorations. I mean, you inherit all of it, and it's very easy to learn about this person even though they're not there anymore. So I have had to inherit when I've been reassigned, when my building's assignments have changed, I can very quickly pick up on their attitudes towards paperbacks, their attitude towards nonfiction, their attitude towards fiction. So it really, these are sort of little mysteries which are fun to tackle. Friends, I am so excited because when Carrie did her presentation, she was very kind and generous in including those resources in our show notes. And as we've done in the past with other guests who have shared their presentations, some of my listeners live in Michigan, but most of them do not. And they wouldn't have been able to see Carrie's presentation, and I didn't. So I'm very grateful that you included your resources in our show notes. So in your presentation, you identify the 4 stakeholders we have to think about when we're building our collection: the student, the teacher, the parent, and the administrator. But I don't think they all get equal consideration, do they?
Well, this is... it depends on the moment and what you're actually addressing. Because while an administrator might bring a need or, hey, here's our school improvement goal, I think that a lot of times we can run into this thing where we're beating against the goads, so to speak. Okay, so my administrator comes and says, hey, we have a new writing goal. This is our school-wide writing goal. Do you have anything? I just want to make sure you're aware of it. And then I take that and I process that. And the reason that's important important is because an administrator goal still touches the teachers, because that administrator goal is, or that school-wide goal is not just for me, right? Or it's not just for the administrator to look good, right? That school-wide goal is there for teachers. So teachers have to figure out how to meet that goal. So in meeting that particular need, I'm also meeting a teacher need because they need resources to meet that goal. Likewise, any great school should be making those school-wide goals based on the needs of their students. So when I am providing resources, when I'm building a collection based around a school-wide goal, that also touches my students, right? That's meeting their academic needs. And I think that that's one thing that we have to also consider, is that while we are a school library in an academic setting, we're meeting academic needs and we're meeting interpersonal needs. We're meeting preferences as well. So we need to blend all of that together. So when I prioritize, I really just look at where am I going to get the most bang for my buck, right? Like, where am I going to touch the most people in my community in order to do that? I can't do that if I don't know the community. So I think that I kind of did a politician thing where I didn't really answer your question directly, but that's my thought.
When you're talking to librarians, I don't think you ever need to apologize. I like what you just said about supporting the students. And when you support the principals, it is political, because the principals need to know that when they have an initiative, regardless of how we might personally feel about these initiatives, we do have to, as contracted employees of the district, we do have to support our principals and the administration in the decisions that they make. And I'm speaking not only about, academic goals, but I would also throw out there something like Leader in Me, or, you're looking at other more character building undertakings. And, and there are still some teachers and, schools that use AR. And this may be somewhat, we might have conflicting feelings about, AR or Leader in Me, or purchasing books that speak specifically to a program, a packaged program.
Right.
By the same token, as employees of the district, we have to support the requests of our administrator. I think about the books I buy every year to satisfy our green team objectives. And I know that each year my green team will come to me and say, hey, we need to, in order to score these points on our green team application, we need to demonstrate something we've done this year, not something we've done last year, but something we've done this year. What books have you purchased for the green team this year? So I get that. There is some politics involved, without a doubt.
Oh, no, I was just thinking about, that's part of the reason I became a librarian, was that whole change maker piece, right? Like, that's part of the philosophy of librarianship, is that when you're in the school library, you're in the role of being a change maker, and you are in the role really as a liaison to those upper administrator initiatives and how they can go into the classroom, right? Like, you're playing in between to build the best program possible. And I love that about being a librarian, but it can be challenging, right? Especially if we don't buy in, but also if we have the right kind of relationship with our administration, we are in a prime position to be offering strategies and that kind of thing. And so now I'm going to go into just a little side note about advocacy, because really, I just want to emphasize that relationship with your principal, when you have a good relationship with your building administrator, that gives you the opportunity to really make change for good, right? Like, so it's our job to strategize. And then the second part of that is we can't wait to be asked. And I say this all the time. Every librarian in my district is like, oh no, she said it again, right? Like, we can't wait to be asked. We have to approach. So, for example, in this time right now, again, COVID pandemic, I didn't wait for my principal to come to me and ask me to, hey, Carrie, can you start thinking about the fall? Because he might not. He's got a lot on his plate. He might be getting so much information that he's not going to necessarily come to me for that support. So I need to offer that support ahead of the game. So I sent him an email. I said, hey, I'm looking forward to the fall. These are things that I anticipate that we could do. And here's how I could see myself playing a role. I'd love to be on your team. Be brave. That's what I want to say about that. So
no, that's fantastic. I'm so glad that you said that, because it really does speak to something else. Last week, I interviewed Courtney Pentland about virtual job interviews, and she pointed me and listeners to this fantastic matrix. It's called School Librarian Interview Questions, and I printed them out because for me, it really is challenging me as a librarian and somebody who's been doing this for quite some time to be better. And it's broken down by leader, instructional partner, information specialist, and teacher. And I scoured this thing for a question on collection development, but you just made me realize one of the questions on this matrix that you could be asked at an interview, friends, is give some examples of how you've been a leader, a change maker, a thought leader. So, Carrie, you're very much on trend.
Excellent.
Yes, no, you're very much on trend. And I think that we are in this feverish effort to make ourselves relevant and to protect our jobs so that we can continue to service our students. We do have to be proactive about what we do. And so when we make those purchases for our principal, when we make those purchases for those building initiatives or for our green team, that we broadcast that in a way that people recognize, see, the librarian is supporting us in the collection. This is where you can find these things in the collection. If it's digital resources, then by golly, put out something so your teachers can find those resources. And permalinks. I've been using permalinks out of EBSCO forever. So using a digital resource and teaching the teachers how they can retrieve those quickly in a teaching opportunity is really, really huge. Carrie, I'm curious, this can be very overwhelming to anybody, regardless of where they are in their profession as a librarian. How do you begin to establish your collection development priorities?
So I usually start because whenever you're hired into a position, let's say, or whenever you're outside of work, you still have contact with your teaching staff. You still have contact with those. So while I know we're there for the students, I feel like teachers that have more direct experience and more frequent experience directly with the students can inform that need. And so oftentimes I am always asking teachers, what are you teaching? When are you teaching it? And what kinds of resources would be helpful? So those are questions I'm always asking my teachers, and I'm gathering that information. And usually they don't, I have a small handful of teachers that will give me an actual name of a book that they really want. Most likely, they're going to give me subject areas that they feel they need some support in, or they're going to give me that kind of thing. With students, I ask the same kind, as you're doing one-on-one reader's advisory with students, they come in and they're wandering around your library for 10 minutes and you're like, they do not know what they want. And so approaching them and trying to talk them through, because, at elementary level, they're still discovering what they even like. And that can change from day to day. And so as you're processing that, then, as you're looking and you're like, oh, my boys want, this boy wants a sports book. Okay. So that's totally a stereotypical, so sorry, I'm using a stereotype there, but, he comes in, he wants a sports book and, I realize, oh, I have, Chris, I have one series that's 30 years old, as opposed to anything that my student today is going to want to pick up. So it's really being able to notice those things as you're helping people find what they're looking for. So I really do it on that first year in a new library is really wishy-washy, kind of like you're just trying to figure out what people need and what they want, and meeting their needs that way. So really, I think the key to prioritizing your collection development is building relationships with the people around you, right? Like, so that's building relationships with your teacher so you can ask and they'll tell you. That's building relationships with students so that they're brave enough to allow you to help them identify a book they might like. And then that's you reflecting on, wow, I didn't really have a lot in this area that, and you'll do that as you're speaking with more and more students, you'll start to identify those areas that are lacking. One thing that I do also is I always have an online form available, a Google form that I put on my website that is for book requests, and they answer a few questions and they send it. And so now I have a spreadsheet of anybody who's requesting a book. So that is a helpful tool if you're like right in the middle of something and a kid wants a book and you don't have it, like you can be like, oh, go fill out the form because I'm going to lose that Post-it note because I know me.
Well, and I think that, we think a lot about what people ask of us, what people ask of our collections. But there, to a certain extent, to a large extent, a lot of our collection development also means bringing to our schools the resources, whether they're digital or they're print, that we need to have because we need to create welcoming collections. We need to create inclusive collections. I remember recognizing just how dated my picture books were and making my own initiative and imposing that on my space because we didn't have an inclusive collection. We didn't have one where kids could look at these books and see, mirrors and not just windows, but mirrors and see themselves in the collection. And it just so happened that 2 years later, my principal said, "Hey, Amy, do we have any?" They just said diverse books. Do we have any books on, diversity? And I said, "Do you mean like welcoming books that reflect families of all different compositions?" And I said, "Actually, I do because I've been purchasing those for quite some time." And it's not because a principal asked me or a student asked me or a parent or a teacher. It's because as the librarian, I recognize that our libraries need to be welcoming and that all of our students, not just the stereotypical boy asking for a sports, for a sports book, but my boy who's asking for unicorn books and princess books. And that happens. And I can happily display those books and you see the smiles on everyone's faces. And because it is a safe space for students to choose what they want. And we want to make sure that collection is one that they are excited to go and peruse.
So definitely, like, it is, I didn't address that at all. But yes, there are some things that our community doesn't realize that they need, right? And we can recognize, okay, here's how we do that. The first grade teacher who reads aloud every year, the book series that's from 1980 something, right? Because that's what they were read when they were a kid. Being able to initiate newer literature that is more inclusive, that is more representative of the communities that we live in, and stuff like that. So yeah, like absolutely, we have to take initiative on much of our collection development, again, because they don't, maybe they can't articulate what it is that maybe they need.
Well, and, when it comes to building our fiction alone, I'm thinking about, I generally don't have to read the books that are flying off the shelf. The books that I'm reading are the ones my students haven't heard of. And so I want to be able to introduce you to, all of these fantastic new titles and invigorate the collection with new and wonderful titles, which, I know as a librarian have a great deal of merit and they reflect own voices. And, these are things that don't necessarily fly off the tip of the tongue of the students and say, hey, Mrs. Herman, do you have this book? And I'm like, I want to show you great literature, especially because you may not know it's out there. And like you said, with the teachers, and God love them, many of them fall back on the classics which they've been using, and because that's what they're comfortable doing. And so it is fun when you can introduce teachers to new titles and feel good that these are going to be great read alouds every year. So I'd like to ask you, you spell out some important steps in collection development, and I just, for those of you, I looked at them. It's analyze your collection, strategize, collaborate, implement, and reflect. Could you give us an example of how you would use this approach, and maybe an area of your library where you use this?
My most challenging is really, do you have any scary stories? So I work in an elementary school. Scary can mean so many different things, and that's not the genre that I like. That's not the genre I live in, which is kind of true and not true. Like, I love mysteries, but like, it's not the same thing. Like, I'm not a kindergartner asking for a scary story, right? And so trying to think about that. But I'm gonna walk through this, and then I can walk through another example that maybe addresses some other issues. But so, for example, if you have that student that comes, do you have any scary stories? And I struggle with this, and I've had this actual thing happen in my library. Like, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I have any scary stories. And then I go through and I do a simple search, and I get the traditional compilations of scary stories told in the dark, or that kind of thing. And then I have, a Goosebumps collection. And when I first actually analyzed that, I didn't actually have the collection. Somebody had gotten rid of all of those books. And so it was still in my catalog, but I didn't have it. So, like, I have Goosebumps, but I don't know if that's the kind of scary they're looking for. I have Michigan Chillers. I don't know if that's the kind of scary they're looking for. And so, like, really trying to analyze, okay, here's what we've got, and seeing, did that meet anybody's needs? And then beginning to strategize, okay, how can I diversify the scary story selection? Where do I need to add in? How do I find these authors? Do I have enough of certain authors that I know, as I've researched those expert lists, right? Like our celebrity lists, okay, how do I know what to order? So that's the part of strategizing. So first, the analyze collection, looking at the collection, seeing what comes up, seeing where you have holes. Strategizing is that's probably strategizing, seeing where you have the holes, and then trying to formulate a plan for how you can fill in and broaden that particular section of your collection. And then the collaborate piece is talking to others. Like, I might talk to teachers at that point and be like, oh, are these kids asking for scary stories in your classrooms? What do you do? What are you giving them? I might collaborate with other librarians and say, okay, what kind of things do you have in their collection? I might collaborate without them knowing. So I might just go to their collection and look and see those kinds of things. And then implementing a plan. Okay, I can set aside $200 for this particular thing. And I know some of you are like, $200 is my whole budget. Sorry. I'm not trying to do that kind of thing, but really just, okay, maybe I can set aside this, or how am I going to pay for these books? Now I've got to figure out a plan. That's part of strategizing and implementing, right? Like, if I'm going to get the books, I have to have a plan to pay for them. And then finally, reflecting on what you purchased. Like, when you get that box, sometimes you're surprised. Sometimes, even though you read the 2 reviews and it got great reviews and you had it recommended, you look and you're like, there's no way this is appropriate for a kindergartner or a second grader, and that kind of thing. And so reflecting on that can inform, what reviews do you trust? Whose opinions do you trust? And that kind of thing, to really meet the need that you're hoping to meet. So reflecting, once you have those books, also, did they go out? Did it meet the need that you were trying to meet? Those kinds of things.
Well, and it sounds like a nice sort of side effect or ripple effect, if you will, is when you are analyzing your collection and when you are looking at what you do have. This is a great opportunity to weed.
Yes, it is.
So much of what we do overlaps with other areas, and when you think about when we scrutinize what we own and what we don't have and identify the gaps, as you said. Is you are going to be looking at with a sort of a fine-tooth comb over your collection and realizing that a great many books don't need to be on the shelf because they're not getting checked out anyway.
Yes.
And it is sort of nice that our collections are transparent like that. We can go, I do feel a little snoopy when I go to other people's collections and say, well, what do they have? Because I don't know. Many of us are lucky to work with circulation software, which has the capacity to make available great statistics and circulation stats and average date of collection. I know I used those printouts to justify a grant that I applied for because coming into my collection that I inherited, the average age of our biographies was 1964. And this was not too long ago. How about less than 20 years? This was probably about 16 years ago, and I printed out this average age of my biographies, and it was 1964. So, but there are many of us who work with either basic circulation software programs or ones that are so antiquated, as in my case, I can't print out reports. So right. I'm doing this very sort of on what I can see on the shelf.
So I'm so glad you asked that. And I had I was looking at that question and thinking, I am pretty sure that any librarian, and I did a little bit of research, anybody can sign up for an account at TidalWave.com. And when you go in there and you have your account, you can go to the collection development area, whether you have Destiny or not, and you can submit your collection. And what that it gives you, there's a list of, let's see here, about 15 different types of circulation systems that you can submit from. It does not have to be Follett Destiny to use tidal wave analysis. So I highly recommend doing that because then you can print out your stuff. It gives you help on exporting your MARC records if you need it, and you can choose a file to upload. Even one of the systems listed here, generic MARC holdings. So I love that. So really anybody can get that help for analyzing your collection. And that's not something that you don't get charged to sign up for a tidal wave. So that's okay. So I would highly recommend doing that because they do give you a full analysis like you're talking about. And I remember us talking about your system and how it's very difficult. It's not very friendly to use in terms of analyzing the collection. But a lot of us are still going to use that walk through the library and looking at the collection themselves. And I don't think that's a bad thing. And as much as we as librarians tell kids not to judge books by their cover, when I am reading, that is absolutely something that I do because I know that if it does not have a certain appeal, if it's from I can pick any book off my shelf and tell if it's from 1980 or 1970 or earlier, just by the way the cover is looking. So really for weeding, I do most of my work on weeding by condition of the book. And then I check the date and I'm like, no wonder I was pulling that off. And that's not to say that old literature is bad literature. Let me definitely put that out there. But you might need an updated version of it. If it's something that's classic and does belong in your library, you might need an updated version of it.
I still get a lot of requests for Judy Blume books. And I I still get a lot of requests for Judy Blume books, but when I walked into my library, they were the sort of canvas covered. It wasn't a glossy, permabound or follette bound. It was a sort of a canvas with the cover printed on it. And so, one of the things I did was I simply replaced my Judy Blume books with updated covers. And they were glossy and brightly colored, and they were clearly made to be a little less dated, to be less dated. And those books flew off the shelves.
Absolutely.
And they flew off the shelves, and I had students asking for them, and the enthusiasm with which they had checking those books out, they were proud to carry those books out. They were excited to carry those books because they looked really beautiful. Another example is, we still have a lot of teachers who use Dr. Seuss. My Dr. Seuss books, I had a full bookcase, but they were all canvas covered. They had the cover of the book printed on there, and it was just so decrepit. And you're right. I mean, judging a book by its cover really does work in some cases. I like what you said about working with the teachers when it comes to trying to identify what kinds of books your kids are asking for, because we do recognize ours is not the only library in the building, that the students have a classroom library. And, you sort of grapple with this idea, are we rivals with that library? Because I don't understand how that library was put together. But really, we are sort of all in the same boat. We want to raise these readers, and doing so with more books is going to help both of us. But talking to our teachers about what books they are offering their students in their classrooms is going to give us an indication of eventually what the kids are asking for in our libraries. It all sort of bleeds together,
It also gives you an idea, that's like totally the positive end, right? Like a teacher gives you information about what kids really like in their classroom, which is awesome. And it can give you information about what's missing from that classroom library and should be in our libraries too, right? Like, so if a teacher, we have to understand that all of those classroom libraries, their purpose is to help children learn how to read. They're learning the process of reading. They're learning the strategies of reading. And most of those classroom libraries are leveled because they need to be practicing strategies. When kids come into the school library, we are helping to develop that love of reading. We're helping to develop their personal interest. We're helping to meet their personal needs and academic needs as they have them. So we are not married to that principle of they can only read a leveled book that's at their level. We are interested in letting them explore the pictures in a book that's too hard for them. We're interested in letting them do all of those things that help develop a love for reading rather than just the strategies for how to read. Because we don't want those kids to grow up thinking, okay, I can only do this. We want to make sure that they have opportunities to understand books as an exploration and not just as a skill. Because we want them, some of our collection development is, I think about culturally responsive teaching and the idea of developing empathy for situations that we don't find ourselves in. But when we're reading about that character and developing that relationship with that character through reading, that helps us develop an empathy for that idea or that situation. And as we're going through that, that's really important to have in our collection. And that's not to say that teachers don't encourage that in their classroom. They absolutely do. And they do encourage that through their classroom libraries, but those classroom libraries are limited and have a specific purpose in teaching the skill of reading rather than teaching the love of reading. And our teachers, most times, they do their read alouds to help build that love of reading in the classroom, and that kind of thing. I have teachers come to me asking me, okay, this kid, he really loves this kind of stuff and I can't get him to read, what do you have here that they might be interested in? So that's the kind of partnership we want to build in a school. We want to be that partner with a teacher to help those readers that can't quite find the thing that loves them. I just got a parent email. We haven't talked about that yet, that connection to parents in the community and how that connects with collection development.
Oh, let's do that. Let's do that. But I think that's an important piece, because parents, we do have, for better and for worse, parents who are very vocal in what their children are reading and what their children have access to. So I'd love for you to speak to how that how that works into this idea of collection development.
Yeah. So a lot of times, I feel like in my experience, having those real conversations with parents is really so important to building a positive community relationship for the library. And so I'm going to touch on a few different things with regard to why it's important to have parents in mind when you are doing your collection development. That is the part of, does my collection meet the needs of my community, right? So we need to understand the values that our community holds that's outside of the school. When I'm doing my collection development, I may have books that I want to add to my collection because I know I have students that need these books to, like you said earlier, to see themselves in a book, to see how that person, to be able to be like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone in this particular situation, right? We need our students to have those books. If I put that on display and shout that from the rooftops in my community, I'm going to, incite, 10 or 15 parents to come in who don't have that same value or stands against something that's in that book. And they're going to come in to try and, make sure that they want to protect their kid from what they, in their minds, have a bias against, or it doesn't fall in line with their values. Okay, so I want to keep that in mind when I'm collection developing, not to say that I shouldn't get that book, but I want to then have to build a strategy. Sorry if I'm not being clear, but
no, you're being perfect. This is very important that it gets said. I agree.
I want to build a strategy for how I can put that book in my collection for the reader that needs it, and have it be accessible to that reader without going against, again, I said beating against the goats earlier. I feel like I love that phrase apparently, but like going against the community, at large, right? So we have to strategize. I want to emphasize that. So strategizing means I put it on my shelf, and I hope I have a relationship with that particular reader so that when they're looking for something, I might be able to recommend it to them directly. If a kid picks up that book and doesn't know what it's about, and I'm going to use this example, I'm just going to be transparent here. So the book George is in my library, right? So somebody picks up that book and takes it home and doesn't, because kids will pick up anything, right? And take it home and give it a try. Through it, and they say, oh, mom and dad, this book is about such and such, right? Like, or they didn't anticipate that. I think every librarian should be prepared for that situation because it's going to happen eventually, right? And so that parent sends me an email and says, hey, my kid checked this out. I don't think this book is appropriate for the library. It's not appropriate for my kid. It needs, that sometimes that's a nice email, right? They might be a lot more aggressive in that email. But we need to be able to anticipate that part and have, this comes to having a collection development plan in place. This is like Library 101. They always tell you the first thing. And I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a district new I could, but I won't, and said, hey, where's our collection development plan? And like, people are like, what are you talking about? You need that in place because we need to have a plan. We need to let those parents read that book fully. They need to understand what the content is. They need to understand the purpose. Understand that usually my first thing is, I'm really sorry that this has, brought this concern into your house, or whatever. I say it much better than when I'm thoughtfully typing my email, but addressing their concern and considering it as a real concern, not dismissing the concern and saying, we have a process if you really want to, if you want that, but here are some things that I can do to, now that you've made me aware that this is something that you don't want your kid to explore in your house, we can set that up, because in a school library, that's different. A public library, I can't really do that. Right. Because that is a different entity. In a public school library, our job is to, be working with all of our parents in all of their value systems. And so coming to a compromise and making sure to say, okay, well, I'll make a flag on the account so that I know that this was something that you didn't want your kid to have at home. But also giving parents an opportunity and encouragement to explore those things that challenge their thinking. One thing that I've done in the past, and this goes to library programming, which is different from collection development, but at my first library, and I haven't really gotten it off the ground at my second one, but doing a parent book club on books that your kids, I use a student book and I say, what would you do if your kid brought this home? Let's have that discussion as adults around the table. How do we handle these difficult things? Because we can't always be sure we know what our kids are reading, right? We don't always know. As much as I'd love to keep up with my middle schooler on the number of books she reads, I absolutely cannot, because she's a much faster reader, So how do you handle those conversations when they come into being? And so making a safe place for parents to discuss those things that are challenging for them to discuss with their kids is really important. And we are the perfect opportunity to build that community and build that conversation around those types of things.
Well, and I love that you mentioned George. I just finished reading Rick. I listened to the audiobook of Rick, and it's delightful and sweet and tender and wonderful. I'm just going to say that not all elementary librarians would make that decision to include it in our collection. And the other title that came up, and is Richard Peck's Best Man. Richard Peck's Best Man, as a student realizes his teacher is dating his uncle, and so it is. But I think that these are opportunities for us to encourage families to have these conversations with their children. It is not our job to, come up against family values. It's about encouraging the conversation to be between the parent and the child, because the child's development as a reader is one that should, be cognizant of their family values, but also give them some freedom to explore these ideas in a book. I think that when we are developing our collection, we have to do so with all our students in mind and be as all-encompassing with our collection and make it as welcoming to our students so that everybody can feel comfortable perusing your collection and see that and feel supported. I think of that not just in keeping in mind with so much of the protests that are erupting right now, but also the fact that it's Gay Pride. Right now it's Pride Month, and I want to have a collection, even at the elementary level, which supports all of my students and makes them feel comfortable and safe. And so, those things should play a role in our collection development.
Absolutely. And I think like you had touched on earlier, that conversation that happens at home, we want those conversations to happen. We need more of those conversations to happen. And sometimes a book is the best place to have that conversation around, because it gives us an inlet to difficult territory. You know, both you and I are parents. My kids are much younger than yours right now. You know, because you have graduating seniors. Yay. But, you know, like we've had difficult conversations in our house around race right now, and around, what our values are as a family and how we value other people and that kind of thing. And that absolutely has to happen at home. And when parents are uncomfortable, it's not a comfortable conversation to have. And so we need to also be helping parents feel a little bit more comfortable having those difficult, challenging conversations that import their family values to their students, and how they operate in the world around them. Right.
Wow.
So
that's fantastic. Carrie, I love this conversation. I could be talking to you forever. I would love for you, if you're comfortable sharing any social media with us, where can listeners find you online?
Absolutely. So I'm gonna be really transparent here that I am. I don't tweet a lot, but I love it. When I get in a mode, I'll tweet and that kind of thing. So our Twitter for our library is at West Maple Media. And anybody, emailing me is the best way to contact for a direct conversation.
The really nice thing about using your school Twitter handle is that we can see exactly the kinds of fun things you are showcasing and the things that you're doing in your programming. And I can't think of a better way to broadcast that to your community and your parent stakeholders when it comes to how you're building your collection and supporting their students as readers.
Yes. Thank you.
I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. I know we have last couple days of school left, and this was really the high point of my day.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, it's a great start to my day. So thank you for having me on the show.
I am so appreciative that Carrie was able to meet and talk with me during what was our last week of school before summer vacation. And I found that she had some great ideas. And especially now that most of us are out, we're able to think about our collections and the types of goals we're going to set for next year. I encourage you to make sure you check all of Carrie's resources that I put into the show notes. If you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. The topic of our next episode will be social emotional learning and my interview with Martha Bongiorno. I hope you will tune in.